A world champion boxer, known for his arrogance, decided to punch a tomb guard for a viral video. He expected the soldier to fall. He never expected the guard to fight back with a skill no ring could teach. The autumn sun hung low over Arlington National Cemetery, casting long, somber shadows across the endless rows of white headstones. The air was crisp and still, filled with a sacred silence that felt like a held breath. It was a place of reverence, where history whispered from every leaf and stone. Into this sanctuary, Jake "Iron" Malone arrived like a thunderclap. At 32, he was the undisputed heavyweight boxing champion, a titan of the sport with a legacy built on brutal knockouts and a carefully cultivated, bad boy, persona. He strode through the crowd of respectfully quiet tourists with the swagger of a king entering his court. He wore a custom-designed, wildly patterned tracksuit that shimmered under the afternoon light, and a heavy gold chain bounced against his chest with every step. Trailing him was his entourage, Tina Lopez, his sharp, ambitious social media manager, her phone already live-streaming to millions, and a couple of gym buddies who served as his sycophantic chorus. "Alright, Tina, make sure you get my good side," Jake boomed, flashing a grin that had sold millions in pay-per-view. "We're about to give the fans a show they'll never forget." Tina, an expert at manufacturing viral moments, framed the shot. "Always camera ready, Jake. What's the plan?" Jake's eyes, full of restless energy, locked onto the tomb of the unknown soldier. There, Corporal Daniel Reyes, a sentinel of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, moved with the inhuman precision of a clockwork mechanism. 21 steps. A crisp turn. 21 seconds of profound stillness. His uniform was immaculate, his M14 rifle held in a white-gloved grip of absolute perfection. "Check this guy out," Jake said, his voice loud enough to make several nearby visitors turn and glare. "All that marching, standing there like a statue. In my world, you stand still, you're asking to get knocked out." Among the crowd, Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a retired Marine with 30 years of service etched into the fine lines around her sharp eyes, paused her walk. She recognized Jake Malone from the sports pages. She also recognized the dangerous, ignorant arrogance radiating from him. Her instincts, honed on battlefields from Fallujah to Kandahar, told her something was about to go very wrong. Ignoring the disapproving murmurs, Jake stepped toward the edge of the plaza where Corporal Reyes had just completed his patrol and now stood at attention. Jake circled him like a predator, playing to Tina's camera. "Look at this guy, folks," Jake narrated. "All stiff and proper. Bet he's never thrown a real punch in his life. In the ring, I'd have him down in 10 seconds flat." Colonel Mitchell had heard enough. She began to move through the crowd, her voice calm but firm. "Son, you're out of line. You're on hallowed ground." Jake turned, momentarily surprised, but his smirk didn't fade. "Hallowed ground, huh? Lady, I respect the troops, but this guy's just a prop. All ceremony, no substance." Before the colonel could respond, Jake made his move. He stepped right up to Daniel Reyes, close enough to see his own reflection in the guard's sunglasses. "Alright, soldier," he taunted. "Let's show these folks what a real fighter looks like." Tina, sensing the viral goldmine, zoomed in. "Do it, Jake." With a speed that had dethroned champions, Jake threw a vicious right hook. The crack of knuckles against bone echoed across the plaza. The guard's sunglasses shattered, the pieces scattering like broken glass on the stone. A thin trickle of blood appeared on Daniel Reyes's cheek. The crowd gasped in collective horror. Jake stepped back, his fist raised, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. "And that," he shouted, turning to his audience, "is how it's done." But the applause never came. The crowd was staring, horrified, at the soldier. Because Corporal Daniel Reyes hadn't fallen. He hadn't even staggered. He had simply absorbed the blow, a human monument of unshakable discipline. The silence that followed the punch was absolute. It was a vacuum, sucking the air from the lungs of every person on the plaza. Jake's triumphant grin faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. He stared at his fist, then back at the guard. He had hit men who weighed 300 pounds and they had crumpled. This soldier, lean and wiry in comparison, had taken his best shot and stood as if rooted to the earth itself. Slowly, deliberately, Corporal Reyes turned his head to face Jake. His eyes, now visible without the sunglasses, were not angry. They were not frightened. They were cold, focused, and utterly devoid of fear. The blood on his cheek was a stark, red declaration against his pale, impassive skin. Jake felt a chill crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. This was a different kind of man. "What the?" Jake muttered, his bravado evaporating. "You're supposed to go down, man." Corporal Reyes didn't speak. Instead, he moved. It wasn't the shuffle of a boxer or the lunge of a brawler. It was a shift of weight, a fluid, economical motion that closed the distance between them in a heartbeat. His body, which had seemed so rigid and ceremonial, was now a coiled spring of predatory energy. His training, forged in the crucible of real-world combat, had taken over. Jake's own reflexes, honed by thousands of hours in the ring, screamed at him to react. He saw the guard's intention, not to retaliate in kind, but to neutralize the threat. He instinctively threw a lightning-fast left jab, a punch designed to stop an opponent in their tracks. He was the champion. He was faster. He was stronger. He was wrong. The crowd held its breath, expecting to see the soldier's head snap back. But Reyes was no longer a stationary target. He moved with a grace that defied his rigid uniform, sidestepping the punch with a fluid, balanced motion, his body dipping low. Jake's fist sliced through empty air, throwing him slightly off balance for a microsecond. It was all the time Daniel Reyes needed. He didn't need to throw a punch. His objective wasn't to win points or to inflict pain for sport. His objective, ingrained in him through years of elite combat training, was simple: control the situation, eliminate the threat. In one seamless, beautiful, and terrifying motion, he executed a technique reserved for close-quarters combat. As Jake's arm was extended, Reyes grappled it, his white-gloved hands moving with practiced precision. He used Jake's own momentum against him, twisting, leveraging, and pushing. Jake felt a pressure on his elbow joint he had never experienced before, a sharp, intelligent force that bypassed muscle and went straight for the weakness in his anatomy. The world tilted sideways. Before he could even comprehend what was happening, he was crashing to the stone plaza. The air was knocked out of him in a whoosh. He landed hard on his back, the champion laid low. Instantly, Reyes was on top of him, not with rage, but with the calm, crushing efficiency of a professional. One knee was planted firmly on the boxer's chest, applying just enough pressure to pin him, to make breathing a conscious effort. Jake's arms, the source of his fame and fortune, were useless, trapped by the guard's unbreakable hold. He looked up into the soldier's cold, focused eyes. There was no anger there. There was no triumph. There was only the calm, dispassionate face of a man completing a task. The crowd stood in stunned, absolute silence. Tina Lopez's phone had dropped to her side, her face pale with shock. Corporal Daniel Reyes leaned down slightly, his voice low and commanding, the first words he had spoken since the confrontation began. "Stay down," he said. "This ends now." Jake struggled for a moment, his pride and professional instincts warring with the undeniable reality of his situation. He was utterly, completely helpless. The man pinning him down moved with an economy and certainty that was alien to the world of boxing. This wasn't a sport, this was a science, the brutal physics of control. Finally, a ragged breath escaping his lips, Jake went still. The fight was over. It was Colonel Sarah Mitchell who broke the spell. Her voice, calm but carrying the unmistakable ring of command, cut through the tension. "All right, Corporal. That's enough. Let him up." As if a switch had been flipped, Daniel Reyes released his hold and stood, instantly resuming his perfect, parade ground posture. He stepped back, his uniform still immaculate despite the scuffle, the blood on his cheek the only sign of the preceding violence. Jake scrambled to his feet, his billion-dollar tracksuit rumpled, his confidence shattered, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. What the hell was that? Jake muttered, rubbing his chest where the guard's knee had pressed. You're no ordinary guard, are you? Before Reyes could answer, Colonel Mitchell stepped between them, her presence immediately taking control of the situation. She was a small woman, but her authority filled the space around her. Arlington security officers were now approaching at a run, their radios crackling. I'll handle this, Mitchell said to the lead security officer, who immediately deferred to her quiet command. She then turned her gaze to Jake, and it was as sharp and unforgiving as a bayonet tip. You, with me. Now. She led Jake to a nearby stone bench, away from the immediate scene. Tina and his gym buddies trailed behind, a confused and chastened entourage. Daniel Reyes remained at his post, standing silently as a medic was finally allowed to approach and tend to the cut on his cheek. Colonel Mitchell's plan was not to have Jake arrested and charged, though she knew that was coming. The legal system would do its part. Her mission was different. It was an ad hoc field operation, a mission of education. Her target was the deep-seated ignorance and arrogance that had led to this disgraceful incident. Her intelligence wasn't classified, it was the history of this sacred place. Her plan was to deconstruct Jake Malone's entire understanding of what it meant to be a fighter. She waited until Jake was seated, his breathing still ragged, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning respect. She let the silence sit for a moment, a tactical pause to let the reality of his humiliation sink in. Corporal Daniel Reyes, she began, her voice quiet but firm, forcing Jake to lean in to hear. Before he was selected for the honor of guarding that tomb, he served 3 tours. 2 in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. He's a combat infantryman. He earned a Bronze Star with valor for pulling his wounded squad leader out of an ambush while under heavy enemy fire. She let that information land. Jake's jaw, which had been set in a defiant line, slackened slightly. That standing still you mocked, the colonel continued, her voice relentless. That's not for show. That's discipline, son. The kind of discipline that keeps a man steady when bullets are flying and his friends are dying. The kind that allows him to make life or death decisions in a split second. To punch you through. To a man who has endured mortar attacks and IED blasts, it was an insult, yes. But it wasn't a threat. She had identified Jake's core belief, that physical power was the ultimate measure of a man, and she was systematically dismantling it with the truth. Her planning was complete. The psychological assault was next. Colonel Mitchell sat on the bench next to Jake, but she didn't look at him. She looked at the tomb, her gaze distant, her voice taking on the quality of a storyteller, a historian, a high priestess initiating a non-believer into a sacred rite. Do you know what it takes to become a tomb guard, Mr. Malone? She asked, the question purely rhetorical. It's a volunteer-only position. Most who apply are rejected. Those who are accepted enter a training cycle so demanding it breaks most of them. She began to paint a picture for him, her words sharp and precise. They must memorize the history of Arlington National Cemetery, including the locations of hundreds of graves. They must pass uniform inspections that are measured in fractions of an inch. Their uniforms alone take hours to prepare each day. A single microscopic flaw means they are not fit for duty. Jake listened, his usual glib comebacks dying in his throat. This was a world he couldn't comprehend, a world where perfection was not a goal, but the bare minimum standard. They work in 24-hour shifts regardless of the weather, the colonel's voice was relentless. They stand guard through hurricanes, blizzards, and soul-crushing heat waves. They are not permitted to drink alcohol or behave in any way that might disgrace the uniform, on or off duty, for their entire 2-year assignment. They live in barracks below the tomb. They sacrifice their social lives, their personal freedom, their very individuality, to become a living symbol of a nation's gratitude. She finally turned to look at him, her eyes boring into his. "And you, in your $500 tracksuit, thought you had the right to put your hands on one of them for a YouTube clip." The shame hit Jake like a body blow, harder than any punch he had ever taken in the ring. He felt his face flush hot, a feeling he wasn't accustomed to. He had built his brand on being shameless. But there was no defense against this kind of truth. I didn't know," he stammered, the words sounding pathetic even to his own ears. "That's the point," Colonel Mitchell said, her voice softening slightly, shifting from attack to education. "You didn't know. You saw a uniform and a ceremony, and you thought it was a performance. You didn't see the substance behind it." She pointed to the tomb. "That man you hit stands guard for soldiers who died without a name. They were blown apart, burned beyond recognition, lost at sea. They are the ones whose families never got a body to bury, who never had a place to mourn. That tomb is their place. It is the heart of this nation's promise that no matter how broken or lost a soldier is in death, they will never, ever be forgotten. Corporal Reyes doesn't stand there for himself. He stands there for them. He is their honor guard." Jake looked over at Daniel Reyes, who had resumed his post at the edge of the plaza, his bearing as perfect and unyielding as ever. He wasn't just a guard. He was a priest. A warrior monk. He was the physical embodiment of a promise. And Jake had spat on that promise. The psychological attack was complete. Jake Malone's entire sense of self, his definition of strength, toughness, and being a fighter, lay in ruins at his feet. The final piece of Jake Malone's shattered ego gave way under the weight of Colonel Mitchell's final lesson. He looked at the tomb, then at Corporal Reyes, then down at his own hands, hands that had brought him fame and fortune, hands that he had always believed were the source of his power. For the first time, they felt clumsy, useless, and vulgar. "In the ring, you fight for a belt, for a purse, for glory," the colonel said, her voice now gentle, almost a whisper. "Corporal Reyes, and all the soldiers like him, fight for the man next to them. They fight for a flag. They fight for a promise made to a grieving mother they'll never meet. It's a different kind of strength, Mr. Malone. It's not about how hard you can hit. It's about how much you can endure for something greater than yourself." That was it. That was the blow he couldn't dodge. A wave of profound, soul-crushing shame washed over him, so powerful it was a physical sensation. He saw his entire life, his manufactured feuds, his staged press conferences, his loud, empty bragging, for the shallow spectacle it truly was. He had mistaken noise for strength. He had mistaken arrogance for courage. He looked at Daniel Reyes, standing perfectly still, the blood on his cheek now dried, a small, dark blemish on his otherwise flawless presentation. That man had more strength in his disciplined silence than Jake had in his entire body and fame. The realization was a quiet, devastating explosion in his mind. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking. The sound that escaped him was not the roar of a champion, but the choked, ragged sob of a broken man. Tina and his entourage watched from a distance, completely stunned into silence. They had never seen their leader, their cash cow, their titan, so utterly defeated. Jake's entire identity had been predicated on the idea that he was the toughest man in any room. In this quiet, hallowed place, he had just discovered he was the weakest. He had faced his ultimate opponent, his own ignorance, and had been knocked out cold. After a long, shuddering moment, he wiped his eyes and looked up, his face stripped bare of all its usual bravado. He looked at Colonel Mitchell, then at the security officers who were waiting patiently. "I get it," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'm ready to face whatever comes. But first," he stood up, his legs unsteady. He turned to Corporal Reyes, who was still standing at his post, an immovable object of duty. "I need to make this right." With a nod from Colonel Mitchell, Jake walked back toward the plaza. The security team followed at a respectful distance. The crowd of tourists, who had been kept back, watched in hushed anticipation. Jake walked with none of his usual swagger. His shoulders were slumped, his head was down. He looked like a man walking to his own sentencing. He stopped a few feet in front of Daniel Reyes. The guard remained at his post, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his presence as solid and unchanging as the marble tomb behind him. Jake took a deep, shaky breath. For the first time in his professional career, in front of an audience, he was not performing. He was utterly, terrifyingly sincere. He raised his head and looked at the young soldier he had assaulted. "Corporal Reyes," he began, his voice cracking with emotion. I have no excuse. What I did was disgusting. It was disrespectful, not just to you, but to this place, to the soldiers you honor, to every person who has ever worn a uniform." He paused, swallowing hard. "I thought I was a tough guy. I thought being a fighter was about what I do in the ring. I was wrong. Dead wrong. Today, you showed me what real strength, what real discipline looks like. It's you. It's what you do here, every single day, without applause, without a prize. You're the real champion." He took a step back and, to the utter shock of his entourage, he bowed his head deeply. It was not a gesture he had ever made to anyone. "I am truly, profoundly sorry," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. Daniel Reyes did not speak. His duty forbade it. He did not nod or change his expression. But as Jake turned to walk away, a new guard, who had arrived to relieve Reyes of his post, gave a single, almost imperceptible nod to Colonel Mitchell. It was a sign of acknowledgement, a silent message from within their sacred fraternity. The apology had been heard. It had been accepted. As Jake walked back across the plaza, someone in the crowd began to clap. It was the father in the Patriots cap. A slow, steady applause. Then another person joined in. Soon, the entire space was filled with a gentle, rising ovation, a sound of forgiveness and grace that washed over Jake, not as a celebration of who he had been, but as an encouragement for the man he had just, painfully, begun to become. Jake Malone faced the legal consequences with a humility that stunned the military prosecutors. He pled guilty to all charges, accepted a hefty fine, and was sentenced to extensive community service with veterans groups. But the real transformation was happening within. He fired his manager, Leo, and broke ties with the sycophantic crew who had encouraged his worst impulses. The viral video of the incident was indeed posted by Tina, but with a new, unexpected narrative. It wasn't a story of a bad boy boxer, it was a raw, unflinching look at his own disgrace and the beginning of his education, complete with a heartfelt, public apology. The story exploded, but not in the way Jake had once craved. It sparked a national conversation about respect, honor, and the meaning of service. He became a different kind of famous, a symbol not of rebellion, but of redemption. He threw himself into his community service with the same ferocious dedication he had once reserved for the ring. He listened to the stories of veterans, of their sacrifices, their struggles, their quiet dignity. He learned. A year later, he launched the Iron and Honor Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to helping troubled young athletes find discipline and purpose outside of sports. The cornerstone of his program was a trip to Washington, D.C. The final lesson was always a visit to Arlington National Cemetery. On the anniversary of his disgrace, Jake returned to the tomb alone. He wore a simple, dark suit, no logos, no flash. He stood silently in the crowd, watching the changing of the guard with a reverence that was now bone deep. The sentinel on duty was a new face, but his movements were the same, perfect, timeless, and profound. As the guard began his solemn walk, his path took him directly in front of where Jake stood. Jake didn't move. He simply stood at attention, his hands folded respectfully, his head bowed. The soldier, in the middle of his perfect 21-step count, did something almost imperceptible. For a fraction of a second, his rhythmic pace paused. A momentary hesitation, a silent acknowledgement between two very different kinds of fighters who understood each other without a word. Then, the perfect cadence resumed. Jake stood there long after the guard had passed, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. It wasn't a tear of shame, but of gratitude. He had come to Arlington a year ago as a champion, and had left a fool. Today, he returned as a humbled man and, for the first time in his life, finally felt like a real fighter. The journey to find honor is different for everyone. Sometimes, it takes a profound mistake to understand what true strength and discipline really mean. What did you learn from Jake Malone's story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of redemption touched you, please like this video, subscribe for more powerful stories, and share it with someone who might appreciate this lesson in respect. And comment, discipline, to show your support.